We keep hearing how the education system for the Palestinians is encouraging the children to hate Israelis, and is there any hope for peace while that continues to be the case, and is there anything that the Israelis can do about it?
Indeed, I think that is a very serious problem, because every new generation is being brought up on values of hatred. It's in the schools, it's in the school books, the teachers, even at UNRWA schools funded by the UN, but also on TV. They have Mickey Mouse on TV explaining that Jews should be slaughtered. I would say it doesn't look very optimistic. However, prior to Anwar Sadat visiting Israel in 1977, if you had asked the average Israeli or the average Egyptian if they think that a peace agreement between Israel and Egypt is realistic, the answer most probably would have been no. After his arrival and speaking in the Knesset, it opened the hearts of Israelis, and the approach changed very, very rapidly. I think that gestures that build the confidence and trust and express the goodwill can go a very, very long way. So while it is very concerning what the younger generation is currently being taught, the current Palestinian younger generation is being taught, I wouldn't say all is lost. It's up to the Palestinian leadership to decide that they want to pursue a different path. I mean, they constantly speak of hope for their people. They are giving them no hope by bringing them up in this way. Hopefully, at some point, they will take the decision to pursue a different path, and hopefully also the international community, which is often very keen on pressuring Israel, will turn also to the Palestinians. And this is again, this is even, you see UNRWA schools, it's the UN relief. It's a different topic, but the only case of refugees having a separate agency in the world is UNRWA. All the rest of the refugees in the world are handled by a different organ. In UNRWA schools, you see the teachers teaching incitement, and the children, young children, chanting after the teacher, "Palestine is ours from the water to the water," meaning from the Jordan River to the sea. No Israel. There will have to be a change in order to make a peace possible, but we do have to believe that it is possible.
Thank you. Another question is right over the other end.
I'm sorry, you said short questions, but you never said short answers.
No, that's fine. Thank you very much. You would like to hear it. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. So I won't name the school, but I was running a program the other day, and we were talking about religious discrimination, and a Jewish student said to me that their solution to the problems in the Middle East would be to remove all the Muslims and kill them. So my question to you is, we talk a lot about incitement, and these acts that are happening in Israel at the moment are terrible and no justification, but what can we do in our Jewish community to stop incitement back at the other side? Like, what measures can we do in terms of these sort of talks and this sort of discussion to not incite, to still support Israel, but then not incite violence back at the Palestinians?
I think, as is the case the other way around, I think there is much importance in leaders, be it political leaders, religious leaders, spiritual leaders, to take a stand against any form of incitement. As, by the way, Netanyahu and other leaders in Israel are taking a stand when some extreme elements in Israeli society are inciting or provoking or behaving in a way that is not constructive. There is no other way other than for people to speak up when a wrong is being done.
Thank you. There's a question in the front row here. The microphone's coming around.
Hi. Israel leads the world in technology, innovation, military stance. Why are we so terrible at Hasbara? Why can we not get our side of the story across?
It's a recurring theme, what you're bringing up. I don't know if it's that we're so terrible at Hasbara. Hasbara, for those not familiar with the Israeli word, is the translation is explanation. It indicates also the assumption that if you just explained things, then people would get it. I think often when it comes to Israel and when it comes to what we are dealing with, people don't necessarily want to hear. They don't want to know the facts. They don't want to be confused with the facts. And it's not about, it's not necessarily about have we explained or not explained. There is also a reality out there that we're dealing with that is not just about whether we've explained to them or not. That being said, I think that over the years there is definitely an improvement. I can say, from my perspective, from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, working there for 11 years now, there is a lot more awareness in Israel for the need to have the information out there, as quickly as possible. We sometimes have the lower hand, because sometimes, I can give you an example, for example, with a flotilla. The flotilla, we were basically, in the international media, we were massacred as it happened. Because the other side immediately went out with information, with releasing a certain narrative, while on our side, we have to check the facts, and we have a process in the IDF, and we don't get out the information until we verify that it is indeed accurate information. By the time we had the information out, the framing had already been set. And we do have sometimes the lower hand because the other side doesn't have any responsibility to the truth or to getting the facts out there. It just wants to get the story out there. It's a challenge that we'll continue to face. And I have to say, being here among many friends of Israel, there is a very important role also for people such as yourselves in assisting Israel with Hasbara, because I think it's very helpful. It's one thing when Hasbara is being done by the Israeli officials. It's another thing when people in the different communities engage, and from their point of view, not necessarily representing Israel officially, when they tell the story, when they, for example, engage and explain that this whole claim of apartheid in Israel is BS. So I think, yeah, it's a challenge that we will continue to face, and I think we can use all the help that we can get.
Before taking the next question, I'd just like to welcome our newest guest in the room, the Honourable James Merlino, Deputy Premier and Minister of Education. James, thank you very much for joining us this evening. There's a question in the middle there, just in front of the pillar. See? Thank you.
Do you have any insight into why the media is so biased towards Palestinians and not giving well-informed view of the situation? And if so, how do you see this issue being addressed?
I think in general, the media tends to accept and even assist the framing that the Palestinians are trying to sell. We have seen it just now. I think also on the invitation for this evening, there were some headlines with regards to the current situation. One of them, I think, is from the BBC on the 10th of October. They came out with a headline that a Palestinian was killed after Jerusalem.
Palestinian shot dead after Jerusalem attack.
Yes. So there was a.
Can you say that again? Say that again, please.
Palestinian shot dead after Jerusalem attack kills 2. A Jerusalem attack had killed 2 people. An attack had occurred, followed by a Palestinian being shot dead. The BBC did not apologize for this headline, did change it after a few hours because it received so many complaints, and said that they had willingly changed it because they had realized that it does not reflect what actually happened. I think it is, on the one hand, it's an example of how biased the media can be. On the other hand, it's also an example of how alert consumers of the media can actually help and change when they see such a blatant bias.
Thank you. There's a question in front of that pillar over there.
So why are these attacks occurring now in particular? Is it part of some kind of cycle, and is it an intifada?
Why they are occurring, sufficient is to see the incitement. In September already, Mahmoud Abbas spoke on TV saying that every drop of Jewish blood spilt in Jerusalem is welcome. These sort of expressions, they go a long way. There are videos in the social media by the Fatah, by Hamas, by ISIS, encouraging Palestinians to go out and attack Jews, attack Israelis. If it's an intifada or not, it is not, I've referred to this, it is not an organized wave of terror now, what is going on. It is different, mostly youngsters taking initiative, being influenced by this incitement, and acting on it. It's difficult to say where it will lead, but definitely if we don't see the Palestinian leadership taking a stand against what is going on, we will not see the situation resolve itself. Today, Mahmoud Abbas is scheduled to speak at a special meeting at the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva. He's been given the stage, although he is not a member state of the UN, he is not a head of state, and in such a forum, one can assume that he's not going to speak to calm down what is going on. And yet he's receiving the stage. We will see what he chooses to do, how he chooses to express himself, not just him, also other leaders, the spiritual leaders, the religious leaders. It's difficult to say where this will lead, but a lot is up to the leadership and what they tell their public.
Yeah, we'll go at the very back.
We've obviously seen a shift in the last 2 weeks, I guess, or over the last week, of, I guess, most of the attacks recently have been taking place in the West Bank. The number of attacks that we saw this week compared to last week is significantly reduced. I was wondering if you could just elaborate on the reason behind this. Is this Israeli security measures? If so, what are they? Or is this something else going on? Just if you could elaborate on what the change has been over the last few days and why we're seeing different numbers.
Just yesterday, there were 2 attacks foiled. There were another 2 teenage Palestinian girls who were caught with knives in their bags. I assume that also the very heavy presence of security forces on the ground has to do with managing to foil some of the attacks. Unfortunately, this is not something that really can be prevented by 100%. And this is not unique to Israel. This is an issue that many countries are now dealing with, discussed also in Australia. How can you even prevent someone who's waking up in the morning, not part of an organization or a group, and deciding that he's taking a knife and he's going to do whatever he was incited to do. The attempts are still there. There is a soldier just yesterday who was injured in Gush Etzion, who is now in hospital.
Right over the far side there.
Earlier you implied that Israel hasn't used excessive force in responding to the security situation. In the interests of Hasbara, could you please explain what happened recently with the Al-Hajj Sion Jaber primary school?
With
the primary school in the West Bank, the Al-Hajj Sion Jaber, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this correctly. There was, according to some news sources, an Israeli military raid on a primary school around Hebron.
When one uses the term of excessive force, and this is something that was also brought up very often, for example, during the last round vis-a-vis Gaza with Operation Protective Edge, the issue of proportionality and the use of force. Israel acts within the law, within international law. It does not mean that there are no casualties on the other side, but it still does not mean that this is necessarily excessive or disproportionate use of force by Israeli forces. When there is a need that the security see in a location or with the arrest of certain elements, they have the duty to do whatever it is that needs to be done to protect Israeli civilians. And I think that is the expectation that any citizen in any country expects his security forces to do for him.
Yeah.
Where's the microphone? Come around the very front here on the side. Thank you. Just that's right. Thank you.
Hi there. Just a practical question, I guess. Israel basically gives money every month to the Palestinian Authority, fund them for their salaries, for whatever purposes money goes towards them. What happens there, obviously, we can't say. But this incitement that goes on by led by Abbas, who is certainly can't be considered a moderate, when all official Palestinian Authority broadcasts have incitement. including by official imams on official Palestinian TV.
Get to the question.
So why shouldn't that funding be contingent upon incitement? Because if there's clear documented incitement, why should funding continue? And if not by Israel, then surely an independent body can monitor it, because these are clearly documented cases. They aren't hearsay.
When you refer to funding, I just have to clarify that the money that is being transferred to the Palestinian Authority by Israel on a regular basis is actually Palestinian money collected by Israel. It is Palestinian money. It is taxes. It is money that we are, through our agreements and arrangements, we are assisting them in collecting and transferring. The measure of freezing this money have partially been tried in the past. It's a very complicated legal issue also, because again, it is not funding provided by Israel. But I do know, for example, that currently the U.S. is in fact looking at taking exactly these measures of decreasing the funding that the Palestinians are receiving from the U.S. In light of the incitement, in the hopes of trying to use that as leverage to get them also to change course of action.
Yeah, at the very back and then across there. Thank you.
I was just wondering, in your opinion, who you think are our strongest partners for peace in both the Israeli and Palestinian communities, if there are any left partners?
The partner for peace on any side has to be the leader and the one who can actually deliver. Because I think as peoples, I think the majority want to live their life in peace. But it takes leaders with courage. It's not an easy decision to take for a Palestinian leader to decide that he is going to resolve this conflict, that he is going to sign a peace agreement with Israel. It means having to face also criticism from the Arab world internally, from some of the segments in Palestinian society. We have yet to see such courage in Palestinian leadership. Netanyahu has reiterated time and again, just yesterday even, he is willing to meet Abbas anytime, anywhere, to sit down to resume peace negotiations. We need to for this.
Thank you. Yeah, just at the very back there. The microphone's just behind you.
I was wondering, how do we understand what Mahmoud Abbas said in the last month in the United Nations, that no previous agreements made with Israel are any longer existing? How do we understand what he said? How do we react to it? And in advance of your answer, I just would like to ask also, you speak with so much clarity and articulation, do you speak also to non-Jewish groups, university groups, other people besides like this kind of group? Sorry, two parts.
Well, thank you. This is actually, starting from the end, this is actually the first large group that I'm speaking to since arriving in Australia. I have, of course, in my previous postings, addressed different crowds. I think it is very important to address. It is important to meet and address our friends, but it is no less important, of course, to meet and address those who are either less of our friends or just not familiar with what is going on. With Abbas's declarations at the UN, two things. First of all, often you have to separate between statements and declarations and between acts and interests. He is, on the one hand, he is inciting and he is not denouncing terror and what is currently going on. On the other hand, security cooperation between Israel and the Palestinians, as agreed also in the Oslo Accords, is continuing to take place, and is very important that it is continuing to take place, because otherwise we would be in a completely different situation. Someone was asking about intifada. This would be one of the characteristics of such an intifada. So we are not there. On the other hand, what you see with Abbas is that he is trying consistently to pursue a certain path unilaterally in different international forums, thinking that if he goes to enough international organizations and has Palestine declared as a state, and goes to the ICC, that will somehow bring him closer to his goal, with the international community often actually supporting him. But this will not make for a state. And I think in this sense, the international community is not only doing wrong by Israel, it is doing wrong by the Palestinians. Because what they are doing by putting the pressure on Israel and often even this, if I may say so, obsession with the settlements as the only obstacle to peace, they are allowing Abbas to pursue a unilateral approach, which is very, very far from the route of direct negotiations. And in the end, there will not be a Palestinian state without these direct negotiations, without agreed upon borders, without an agreed upon a solution for the issues of refugees, for the issues of Jerusalem, for all of the issues that need to be discussed in direct negotiations by the two parties.
Firstly, congratulations on your new appointment, and we look forward to a long, fruitful relationship with the Melbourne Jewish community. My question is regarding the true democracy of Israel, and if you like, we see a number of Arab members of parliament that have come out inciting some of the violence and have made some really obscene comments publicly. What has the reaction been on the ground in Israel about that? And has there been potentially any legal challenges or any further discussions about their role as elected representatives countering, attacking and talking up against the state that they're meant to be representing?
I think the point that you're bringing up is one that is receiving considerable discussion in Israel. Because indeed we have seen some very, very problematic statements. Even just today, we had another Arab Knesset member go to the Temple Mount and issue different statements against the state of Israel, etc. It's a very fine line. It's a very fine legal line. But I have to say it is also what I take pride in, because it is part of what makes us a true democracy. You can say almost anything in Israel. We have the most open discussions about everything. And when I say almost anything, it can be even in Haaretz newspaper, who is often more critical than the most critical of European newspapers, for example, when it comes to the government policy. And I think that while debating where exactly is the red line, I think mainly we can take a lot of pride in the fact that we do allow for representation to all. We do allow for freedom of speech. And I see it, although very frustrating, I see it also as a very positive thing.
We'll take one more question. Yeah, right on the aisle there in the middle.
What can Israel do to make the world understand that similar events occurring in France and Brussels and in the Jewish Museum and even in Melbourne, to help the world understand what is being dealt with is not nationalism but rather religious fundamentalism?
I think in a way there is more understanding with these terror attacks, with internationally, with also this growing awareness of ISIS and the dangers that it poses, with many countries seeing their own citizens traveling to fight and be involved in Syria and Iraq, coming back, the danger that it poses to them back home. I think in a way it's drawing us closer, and perhaps even bringing to more understanding of what we're dealing with. I recently saw here that after the attack by the 15-year-old here in Australia, there were discussions here about the age 14 or 16, what is allowed, detention. This is, for example, a topic that Israel has been criticized for so often and for so long, about the detention of minors and how minors are being treated, etc. And I think that with these unfortunate occurrences also around the world, there is a realization that it is not what you want to deal with, but it is what you have to deal with. We have currently the 13-year-old terrorist in Israel who stabbed, along with his 15-year-old brother, they stabbed the 13-year-old Israeli who was riding his bike, who was just released yesterday from hospital after 2 weeks in hospital. And yesterday he was quoted in the media complaining that he doesn't want to be in jail, and he's not being treated nicely. And taking a step back and looking at this 13-year-old, it really is a double crime. Because what he did is a crime against the young Israeli. But what the Palestinian incitement is doing to him, that brings a 13-year-old child to do such a deed and to find himself now in the situation that he is in, it's also a crime against him.
Thank you. I will now hand over to Philip Chester to wind up the evening.
I can step down?
Yeah, please.